A couple of months ago, Megan and I were down in Montecito, California, where our daughters live. And it was about lunchtime, and we were hungry, and we've got a favorite sandwich spot. So we thought that we would go and grab a sandwich. And part of the reason that we like to go to this place is because the sandwiches are good, they're relatively inexpensive, and there's this nice little outdoor eating area that they have in the shopping center. There's picnic tables and umbrellas and trees, and it's just a pleasant place for lunch. So we went in, we got our little panini, we got them all wrapped up, and we walked around the corner to go around another corner to get to the picnic table that we were going to sit at. And as we were walking along, we heard a voice. Not God. It was Ellen DeGeneres. And we turned the corner, and there was Ellen standing there. And I would have said hello, nonchalantly, like I see her every day, Ellen. But she's on the phone, so I didn't want to make a big deal about it. But she was like from me to where the candles are, from the picnic table. So we went ahead and just walked around Ellen, sat down at the picnic table, and Ellen's standing beside me. And I'm like, do I get out my phone and take a selfie, me with Ellen in the background? I'm like, no. I don't want a picture of me with basil stuck in my teeth and Ellen glaring at me because it'd be totally obvious what I'm doing. So she's standing there talking on the phone. I'm like, well, instead of taking a picture, I'm just going to listen to what she's talking about. It sounds a little bit like I'm a creeper, but it's a public place, and she's talking on the phone out loud. And so I'm listening to what she was talking about. And I don't know whether she was talking to a business partner or a manager or agent, whatever, but they were doing some business deal. And as I listened to her, I kept thinking to myself, wow, Ellen is really nice. You don't know. I've seen the show a couple of times, and she gives things away, and she seems nice, but can you really tell how somebody is when you only see them on TV? I'm like, Ellen is really nice. I've seen her, and now I know. Have you ever wondered what God is like? You might have heard some stuff about God. You might have some opinions about God. But have you ever stopped to think about what God is like? Or maybe are there some things that you're afraid that God is like? Maybe you're afraid that God is angry. You look around at a lot of his people, and they seem to be mad about something all the time, so maybe God's mad too. Or maybe you think about some of the things you've done, and you think if God knew about those things, he might be pretty ticked off. Maybe God's angry. Or maybe you think that God is absent. You look around at the stuff that's going on in our world and all of the chaos, and you think, how can there be a God when these things happen? Or maybe you think to some traumatic event in your life and think, how could that have happened if there was a God who was present? Maybe there was a God and he's been on vacation for a very long time. Or maybe you're afraid that God is simply not powerful enough to handle what's going on in the world. Maybe he created it all, and he had a really great design and a plan and purpose for that, and it just simply got too big for him to control. Look at some of the stuff that goes on. If there was a God who was powerful, wouldn't he do something about that? Maybe that's what you think about God. But in some sort of way, like I was able to bump into Ellen and find out what she's really like, God comes around so that we can find out what he's really like. And that's really what's going on at Christmas. Jesus comes as a baby in a manger so that we can know what God looks like. We've been walking these 4 Sundays of Advent through the Gospel of John, and we heard a little bit of it, and I'm going to read a couple more verses to address what I'm talking about here. John writes and says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Out of the fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." In other words, Jesus comes to show us what God looks like. And what Jesus reveals to us is that God isn't angry. And God isn't absent, and God isn't powerless. Quite the contrary to all of those things. Christmas tells us that God is present, and He comes as the God of grace and truth. I don't know about you, but in this quiet moment, in this sacred space, as we've come to remember that first silent night, the idea of grace and truth is like water to my soul. Because I have grown weary of the chaos. I've grown weary of the division. I've grown weary of the fighting in our lives. Whether it's on the national political level, whether it's among friends, whether it's on social media, or whether it's even just among families. We are living in a very harsh and very divisive time. And I am just so tired of all of it. And so this idea that Jesus comes at Christmas time filled with grace and truth, it makes me just want to stop and be quiet and just kind of drink that in for a moment and just let my soul rest in the fact that God is doing something different, filled with grace and filled with truth. All grace and all truth all of the time. Because if you just have grace without truth, you kind of have license or just permission to do whatever you want to, and that raises a whole host of other issues. That's a bondage of its own. And if you just have truth without grace, that just becomes harsh and judgmental. And if we were just telling truth to people without grace or love in our hearts, we basically are just at war with them. Jesus comes with grace and truth all of the time. And I'm so ready for that. I'm ready for grace because it seems like we're no longer able to have a discussion at any level, political, social media, or family, without the discussion turning into a debate. And if it's a debate, you have to win the debate. And the only way to win the debate is to crush your opponent. And all of a sudden, instead of friends that we have a differing opinion with, we have enemies. And everything begins to break down. I miss grace. I'm tired of the harshness and the need to crush people who aren't exactly like us. And I long for truth. I mean, I understand that some things are true for me that may not be true for you. I get that. But I also believe that there's real truth. And I also believe that some things are right and some things are wrong, even if they are politically expedient or speak towards your political goals. Some things are right and some things are wrong. And I'm tired of relativity. I'm tired of it being right when it's my guy and wrong when it's your guy. I have a long memory, and I remember when you thought it was right or you thought it was wrong, and now we've changed. But I'm tired of the relativity. And I love the fact that there's right and there's wrong. And God comes to bring us truth along with grace, and grace along with truth. And my soul longs for that. And I'm so grateful that's the promise of Christmas. And I think about that first Christmas and the people that were there and how they experienced this. I mean, think about Mary and Joseph, two basically teenagers who are away from family. She's pregnant. And yeah, God has told him he's doing something, but all the gossips in the neighborhood are talking about it. And they've just gone on a 90-mile ride on a donkey, and she's uncomfortable, and they don't know where they're going to stay, and everything is going wrong. But in the midst of it, God does show up and proves that what he said to Mary was true. And he shows up with love for her and for Joseph. I think about the shepherds who were among the first people to hear about the good news of Christmas. The shepherds were just the lowest of the low. I mean, nobody hoped that their kid would grow up to be a shepherd. Nobody wanted that. You became a shepherd if there was nothing else you could do. And yet the first message of the good news that God is among us with grace and truth comes to the shepherds. God graciously reminds us that his love and his care extends even to the lowest among us. And then at completely the other end of the spectrum, whether they showed up that night or they came 2 years later or anything in between, you've got the wise men, the magi, the kings from the Orient, They are highly educated. They are wealthy people. And they still recognize that there's something missing. And when they come and they encounter Jesus, they find the truth that they've missed. But Christmas isn't just about Jesus being a baby. It's about what Jesus comes to do, about how he grows up and shows us more fully what God is like, and eventually dying on the cross, being raised by the power of God, breaking the power of sin and death. And I think about Jesus' encounter with various people. I think about the time that he comes across a tax collector. And this tax collector is richer than Midas, but he still aches on the inside for everything that he doesn't have. And rather than condemning him, Jesus goes to lunch with him. And by the time they are done with lunch, all of a sudden, Matthew is part of the family because he's found something in Jesus, God's love, God's grace that he's never known before. I think about the time that Jesus encountered a woman at the well, and he speaks truth into her life. He says, look, you've been married 5 times. And the guy that you're with now, you're not even married to him. But he speaks the truth to her with grace and love because he knows the only reason she has been with all of those guys is simply because she's looking for a guy that won't use and abuse her. And Jesus extends grace and dignity to her. And it just goes on and on and on. But it's not just about back then, it's about now too. That Jesus shows us in the midst of our harsh environment, in the midst of whatever your year was like, that there is grace and truth for us. I love how throughout the stories in the Gospels, Jesus keeps encountering people, and he looks at them with love, the way that I think he looks at us, and he basically looks at them and says, your life is messed up, but I've come to help. And that's the truth that Jesus speaks to us too. We're broken. We're frail. We're messed up. But God doesn't come just to thump us with a 2x4. God comes to help. And we need to hear the truth when Jesus says, people who sin are in bondage to sin, but those that the Son sets free are free indeed. Which means that no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, no matter what's been done to you, your future can change. And you are loved just the way you are. We need to hear the words of grace that Jesus says to us. Everybody who's tired, everybody who's weary, everybody who feels beaten down, all of you who are like, I don't know if I can go on anymore, come to me and I will give you rest. Jesus shows us the God who is filled with grace and truth. But the story doesn't end with us. Because most of the time, Jesus shows up through his people. And there's a whole world that's living in harsh conditions on the political situation, with their family members, at work. And they long to know the grace and truth of God among them. And God uses us to show what kind of God we have. A couple of weeks ago, I was out running with my dog, Bailey. Bailey is a lab and border collie mix. He's black, except that he has a white chest that has black spots on it, and all 4 paws are white. He's a really cute dog. And so I take him running. And this particular morning, we were running from the Cushman Trail behind the old Fred Meyer, where it goes down next to the freeway, kind of down by Wilco. And then there's a spot where it goes on city streets, kind of between Pioneer and Stinson, and then continues down onto Rosedale. I tell you only so that you will know this is really true. I'm not making this up. And we were running back south this direction, again, same reason. And it's about the same time that the elementary school buses are going around to pick up kids. And apparently there's one kid that gets picked up in the parking lot by the dentist's office there between Stinson and Pioneer. And so I'm running along there, and I see this little boy, and his mom is sitting in a van there too. And I'm running along, and the boy goes, "Hi." I'm like, "Hi." And the kid goes, "Your dog is horrible." I'm like, "What? My dog is not horrible." So I'm running along, and I'm like, did I hear that right? So I said, my dog is what? And the kid says, your dog is horrible. And I'm thinking, what a strange thing to say. But I think, Megan works for the school system, and she tells me, there are some kids that have challenges, and, they say things, and I'm like, okay, this is not beyond the pale. Maybe that's what I'm dealing with here. And I'm like, no. Anybody who says something like that, he's horrible. And probably his mother is horrible because she raised such a rotten kid. And I'm thinking all of this as I'm running along with my dog. And so I'm like, I'm going to tell him, you're a horrible kid. And I'm like, he's 6. You can't say that to him. There's a bit of a power differential between me and him, But so I'm like, okay, I'm going to rise above. So I go, well, Merry Christmas to you. And the kid goes, running along, Merry Christmas, bye. And I'm like, that is so strange. And running along, and all of a sudden I go, you are an idiot. I'm like, the kid didn't say your dog is horrible. The kid said your dog is adorable. And in that moment, I was so grateful that I had learned something about the grace of God. I was so grateful that what I first thought was not what came out of my mouth. It is axiomatic that we become like what we worship. You are becoming like whatever is most important to you. And I will fully admit, I get to choose the stories I tell you. I tell you the ones where I look good. But at least you saw the mental process that went on there. But to me, it was encouraging because there was a time where I probably would have just told him he was a horrible kid. And I'm like, okay, hanging around with Jesus seems to be making a difference. This is good. So I really enjoyed the rest of my run. Wherever we go, we encounter people who live in a harsh world, who are just as hungry as we are, whose souls are just as parched as mine is, for a word of grace and truth, to be reminded that no matter what their lives seem like today, there is a God who is not angry, who is not absent, and who is not powerless, but stands among them, wanting to shower them with his love and his grace and his acceptance. And so my prayer for you tonight is that as we ponder in this sacred space, that first silent night, all it means for God to come among us in grace and truth, that you would fully appreciate that in your life, and that you would go out and be nice to 6-year-olds wherever you find them. Would you pray with me? Loving God, I want to pray for people in this room tonight who are walking through difficult situations. They may feel abandoned by you. There may be some really tough things that are going on, difficult decisions or hard circumstances. God, may you remind them of the truth that you are present with them and that you are a God that has a good plan, that you are filled with grace and truth for them. God, for those of us that are afraid that you're angry, would you help us instead to hear how much you love us and how you just desire for us to come home. And God, we pray for us as we go out into our everyday lives, as we encounter challenging family members, as we work with difficult people at work, or even as we just pass a kid that we didn't hear correctly. May we be really accurate representations of what God is like. We're so grateful for what you have done for us through Christmas. In Jesus' name, amen.